Apartheid, the system of state-sanctioned racial segregation, shaped South Africa for nearly half a century. Its legacy is etched in the lives of millions. Even before 1948, laws had prepared the ground for this injustice. For example, the 1913 Natives Land Act confined black South Africans to just 7% of the land, forcibly evicting families and entrenching poverty. Such laws, along with pass rules and segregated schools, created a rigid two-tier society. In this climate, a generation of black leaders emerged. Nelson Mandela, who would become South Africa's first black president, later described his struggle as fighting against white domination, as well as against black domination, cherishing the ideal of a democratic and free society. His life, from lawyer to revolutionary to political prisoner and president, mirrors the arc of apartheid itself. Before apartheid was ever named, South Africa had a long history of racial segregation. Key laws laid the groundwork. The 1913 Natives Land Act, for instance, allocated only 7% of land to black people, later raised to 13%, reserving the remaining 87% for whites. Blacks were prohibited from buying land outside these areas, effectively uprooting thousands of families. Other laws, such as urban segregation acts of the 1920s and the 1936 Land Act, tightened these controls. The pass laws, in force since colonial times, forced black South Africans to carry identity books that police could check at will, restricting where they could live, work, and travel. These early measures cemented white supremacy in law. The Afrikaner National Party, which arose out of Afrikaner nationalism, saw itself as carrying a God-given mission of white rule. When it won the 1948 election, it gave a name to its policies: Apartheid, Afrikaans for apartness. In 1948, the National Party government under D.F. Malan began systematically expanding segregation into an elaborate legal framework. Within years, it enacted dozens of laws to enforce white dominance. Each of these laws codified discrimination. Blacks were prohibited from voting in national elections, barred from using the same public facilities as whites, and forbidden to own land or farms outside reserved homelands. In effect, apartheid dictated where South Africans, on the basis of their race, could live and work, the type of education they could receive, whether they could vote, and who they could associate with. By the early 1950s, millions of black South Africans were confined to overcrowded townships and dry rural homelands, their basic rights stripped by law. Despite these restrictions, opposition grew. In 1952, the ANC and allied groups launched the Defiance Campaign, using non-violent civil disobedience against past laws and segregation. Thousands of volunteers courted arrest by deliberately violating apartheid restrictions. They burned their passbooks, sat in white-only areas, and protested round the clock. Mandela himself helped organize this campaign as a young lawyer with the ANC. Another watershed was the 1955 Congress of the People at Kliptown, where leaders of all races adopted the Freedom Charter. It began with the bold declaration that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. No government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people. This charter, co-authored by Mandela and others, outlined an inclusive vision of democracy, land reform, and equal rights. The white government cracked down immediately. Police broke up the meeting and later charged over 150 activists, including Mandela, with treason. The trial lasted until 1961, but ended in acquittals. The very act of defiance had broadened the struggle's appeal and steeled its leaders' resolve. Apartheid's harshness provoked resistance and tragedies alike. Protests became more common and more dangerous in the 1950s. One early flashpoint was the Sharpeville massacre of March 21, 1960. Black South Africans, organized by the Pan-Africanist Congress, gathered peacefully outside the Sharpeville police station to protest past laws. They came without their passbooks, surrendered themselves for arrest, and sang freedom songs. Witnesses recall that the atmosphere was cheerful as 20,000 people sang and chanted "Down with passes." Without warning, however, police opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Over 250 rounds were reportedly fired. 69 people, many of them women and children, were killed, and more than 180 wounded. Almost all the victims were shot in the back while fleeing. One survivor, Lydia Mahabuke, later recalled trying to escape as people were falling, scattered. There was blood streaming down my leg. I tried to hobble. I struggled to get home. The massacre sent shockwaves worldwide. South Africa's government declared a state of emergency. It detained 11,000 people and banned both the ANC and PAC. Sharpeville became a watershed. Internationally, it turned apartheid into a global scandal. News of Sharpeville helped focus international criticism on South Africa. The United Nations soon condemned apartheid as a crime against humanity, and countries began economic and cultural boycotts. Even sports teams were barred. South Africa was banned from the Olympics and lost rugby tours due to protest. Inside South Africa, anger simmered. The government lashed out with further repression, but the world's outcry meant the regime was increasingly isolated. In the years after Sharpeville, tensions mounted. In the Rivonia trial, from 1963 to 64, the government rounded up leaders of the now illegal ANC and MK, the ANC's guerrilla wing. Mandela, already serving 5 years for leaving the country illegally, was one of the accused. In a historic speech from the dock, he offered a moral defense of the struggle, declaring, "During my lifetime I have dedicated myself to this ideal of a free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The judge found him guilty of sabotage and sentenced him to life imprisonment on June 12, 1964. Mandela and his comrades avoided the death penalty, but Robben Island prison awaited. For over a decade, resistance had ebbed and flowed. One of the most dramatic uprisings came on June 16, 1976, in Soweto, the sprawling black township outside Johannesburg. Thousands of schoolchildren marched peacefully to protest a government decree forcing them to learn in Afrikaans. These young people chanted slogans like "To hell with Afrikaans" and "Down with Bantu education" as they walked to Orlando Stadium. By some estimates, around 10,000 students joined the march by the time it met police at a crossroads near Orlando High School. Authorities tried to scatter the crowd with tear gas and police dogs. The students responded by throwing stones. Accounts differ, but soon at least one officer fired a warning shot, and then the line of police opened fire with live ammunition. In the chaos, dozens were injured, and 2 youths were killed in the first volley: 15-year-old Hastings and Lovu, and 12-year-old Hector Peterson. Hector's death, captured on camera, made headlines around the world and became a rallying symbol. What began as a peaceful school protest quickly escalated into days of turmoil. Students and young people from Soweto and other townships set fires to schools and police vehicles. Clashes with security forces broke out across the country. The Soweto uprising laid bare the brutality of the apartheid state to a new generation. Worldwide, it intensified calls for change even as the government imposed another state of emergency and tightened controls. Nelson Mandela's own journey epitomized the struggle. Born in 1918 to a royal clan in the Eastern Cape, he became a lawyer and ANC leader. In 1944, he co-founded the ANC Youth League, pushing the organization to adopt mass action. In 1952, Mandela and Oliver Tambo opened South Africa's first black law firm. That same year, he was instrumental in launching the Defiance campaign, traveling the country to recruit volunteers for the anti-pass protests. He also helped draft the 1955 Freedom Charter, cementing a vision of equality that defied apartheid's laws. Mandela's activism quickly made him a target. He was repeatedly banned, legally barred from meetings, and even writing from 1952 onward. In 1956, he was arrested with 156 others and charged with treason for their opposition activities. The trial dragged on for years, but ended in acquittal in 1961. By then, after Sharpeville, the government had outlawed the ANC and declared resistance illegal. Mandela went underground and co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the ANC's armed wing, in 1961. Training as a guerrilla and speaking out against apartheid led to his capture. On August 5, 1962, Mandela was arrested at a roadblock and initially sentenced to 5 years in prison. Then came the Rivonia trial in 1963 to 64. Mandela and other MK leaders were convicted of sabotage. His eloquent speech from the dock, quoting from the ideals of the struggle, made him an international symbol. Imprisonment transformed Mandela into a global icon of resistance. Overseas, posters of his smiling face became a rallying cry. Inside South Africa, rumors of his health and status haunted activists. But even in prison, Mandela remained a leader. He secretly corresponded with comrades and kept hope alive. He later recalled that as he walked out of his cell on the day of release, he had to leave his bitterness and hatred behind, or he would remain a prisoner in spirit. While South African activists endured prison and repression, the world's pressure on apartheid intensified. The United Nations passed resolutions condemning apartheid. By the 1970s, it was officially labeled a crime against humanity. Countries imposed economic and cultural sanctions. For example, US and European companies faced investment boycotts. Banks refused loans, and artists and athletes refused to perform or compete in South Africa. Churches, student groups, and unions around the globe held demonstrations. Free Nelson Mandela became a common chant, and demanded democratic change. Even British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a controversial supporter of constructive engagement, admitted later that sanctions played a role in pushing reforms, though South African conservatives often blamed communist plots instead. One turning point came in 1986, when the US Congress overrode President Reagan's veto to pass an anti-apartheid sanctions law. Switzerland froze assets, the Soviet bloc ceased trade, and the Commonwealth of Nations denounced the regime. International trade, tourism, and cultural isolation made apartheid increasingly untenable. Nelson Mandela's name alone inspired solidarity efforts worldwide. The Free Mandela campaigns, divestment movements, and boycotts turned South Africa into a pariah state. The economic pinch and moral condemnation strengthened reformers inside the country. By 1989, the apartheid state was under unsustainable strain. In February 1990, President F.W. de Klerk Mandela's successor as deputy president of the National Party stunned many by announcing major reforms. He lifted bans on the ANC and other political parties, repealed key apartheid laws, and agreed to negotiate an end to white minority rule. Most dramatically, on February 11, 1990, de Klerk released Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years of incarceration. This moment, broadcast live on television, was among the century's most emotional images. Mandela, in a dark suit, walking free and raising his fist in triumph. Negotiations quickly followed. South Africa's old order was dismantled piece by piece. In 1991, Parliament repealed remaining racial laws. For example, the last passed laws were abolished. A new interim constitution was drafted, guaranteeing rights for all races. Meanwhile, violence and intimidation by hardliners flared in some townships and rural areas, as many feared the future. But Mandela and de Klerk committed to dialogue. Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in 1996 exposed the brutality of the past, with Archbishop Desmond Tutu urging victims and perpetrators alike toward forgiveness. All of this culminated in April 1994. South Africa held its first free, multiracial elections. The African National Congress won a sweeping majority, and Nelson Mandela was inaugurated on May 10, 1994, as the nation's first black president. Crowds of all races celebrated. Mandela's message in that moment was one of unity. He proclaimed a new era where never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. He later humbly noted, "I am not a saint unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." The era of legally enforced apartheid was over. The end of apartheid marked a monumental achievement for South Africa and the world. Under President Mandela, the country adopted a progressive constitution and joined the global community once more. Mandela's government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, allowing the nation to confront its past abuses. The ideals enshrined in the Freedom Charter, equality, shared wealth, free education, inspired many of the new laws. However, the scars of apartheid did not vanish overnight. South Africa remains deeply unequal, with gaps in land ownership, income, and social services that echo the injustices of decades. Yet Nelson Mandela and his successors sought to heal the nation's wounds through tolerance and democracy. Mandela famously emphasized reconciliation over retribution. he told South Africans that South Africa belongs to all who live in it and called for building a rainbow nation out of diversity. Today, Cape Town's spectacular architecture and Johannesburg's vibrant streets sit alongside townships and former homelands. Monuments like Robben Island, where Mandela spent 18 years, are now UNESCO heritage sites and museums that remind the world of apartheid's cruelty. Nelson Mandela passed away in 2013, but his legacy endures. His leadership helped transform a divided land into a democracy, and his words and deeds continue to inspire global movements for justice. The story of apartheid, from forced removals and massacres to Mandela's long walk to freedom and the founding of a free South Africa, remains a profound tale of injustice overcome by resilience